Welcome to Doing the Work, Frontline Stories of Social Change, where we bring you stories of real people working to address real issues. I am your host, Shimon Cohen. In this episode, I talk with Jasmine Banks, who is the executive director of UnKoch My Campus, a national campaign that investigates and exposes how right-wing billionaire Charles Koch and his Koch network influence education, both in higher ed and K-12. Many of you who follow the podcast already care about racial, social, economic, and environmental justice, care about multiracial democracy, but do we always know the hidden influences of the agenda that opposes all of this, utilizing right-wing think tanks, research, and targeted campaigns? Jasmine explains what the Koch network is and how, through multi-million-dollar contributions, they promote ideas and policies that suppress voting rights, question climate change while actually advancing it, deny the reality of COVID, attack workers' rights, and are behind the widespread efforts to ban any discussion of slavery and systemic racism in schools by attacking critical race theory and the 1619 Project. She shares that Koch helped fund the January 6th attempted coup and that multiracial democracy is truly at stake. UnKoch My Campus has released reports of how the Koch network carries out its agenda, and those reports are available on their website. Jasmine explains how UnKoch My Campus works with students who organize to challenge the Koch agenda. She explains how the ruling of Citizens United treated corporations like people and how there is basically unchecked financial influence corporations have over elections and legislation. Policy folks often say we need to follow the money, and Jasmine does a phenomenal job in breaking this down. Jasmine also shares how she got into this work and talks about working as a therapist. I hope this conversation inspires you to action. Before we get into the interview, I want to let you all know about our episode sponsor, the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work. First off, I want to thank them for sponsoring the podcast. UH has a phenomenal social work program that offers face-to-face master's and doctorate degrees, as well as an online and hybrid MSW. They offer one of the country's only political social work programs and an abolitionist-focused learning opportunity. Located in the heart of Houston, the program is guided by their bold vision to achieve social, racial, economic, and political justice, local to global. In the classroom and through research, they are committed to challenging systems and reimagining ways to achieve justice and liberation. In 2022, they will continue their ongoing series, Eyes on Abolition, that explores abolitionist practice and as a critical framework to bring about change, and invite you to join them in April when they host Becoming Abolitionist author Derricka Purnell. Go to www.uh.edu/social work to learn more. And now, the interview. Hey, Jasmine, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. So excited to hear you talk about the work you're doing with your organization, UnKoch My Campus. And I'm excited to have learned about you all and have you on to share about this really important work.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So I think, just to start out, maybe let folks know, an overview of what you all do, and then we'll get into a number of the specifics.
Yeah, so generally, UnKoch My Campus is a intervention or disruption campaign that targets Charles Koch and his dark money network. He is a really radical right-wing billionaire. He has been characterized by historians as an oligarch, sort of like a corporate or oligarchy. And you might wonder why it matters within education, public education, and higher education in particular. Well, both K through 12 as well as higher education are institutions that really help to preserve the possibility of a multiracial democracy. And Charles Koch, who is famous for being a climate denier, for stalling progress on voting rights and economic justice, and most recently helping fund the insurrection as well as COVID denial, utilizes his multi-million-dollar nonprofit donations to universities to influence both ideas and culture as well as policy production. Most of the things that you are familiar with around legislation, well, they started at the side of the university, right? Like researchers and think tanks struggled through data and ideas, and then they made recommendations to elected officials and the highest courts in the land and legislators in the land. And so through these think tanks that are majority at the side of the university, the Koch network has been able to roll back economic freedom, propose regressive social policy, as well as deregulate the fossil fuels industries at the peril of our climate and our communities. So it's really, really important work. And I've been at it for, this is my 4th year now.
Yeah, it's so important. And, the folks who follow the podcast care about these issues, right? Like, people who listen to this podcast are already, or access this podcast through transcripts, are already, for the most part, really care about multiracial democracy and racial justice and social justice. And I think often, though, we don't know, like, you all peel it back and get back to like, okay, so we know there's voter rights and voter suppression going on in all these states, right? Or passing legislation to make it harder and harder for people to vote, especially Black people, right? And folks of color. So just on that issue, let's peel it back of like, where does that begin and how do these strategies happen that are funded by this Koch network?
Yeah. So there are things that the average person who's just, like me, like a working class mom of 4, I didn't know before I got into this work, I didn't know what a think tank was. But there are these things called think tanks, and there are these folks called lobbyists. And ultimately with, particularly after Citizens United, which was a ruling that made corporations into people and really changed how much money could be spent within elections, our current government construct is that whoever has the most money gets the most power. And that's really where the crux of Charles Koch and his dark money network and their power brokering is. So why would they want to erode voting rights? Why would they attack communities of color from coming out and voting and governing? We the people, are the people that the government should be answering to. Well, that's because the Koch network, along with ALEC, which is American Legislative Exchange Council, which is sort of like their corporate business commerce wing of their network, they are disproportionately invested in the profits within their corporation and their shareholders' desires, right? So if we, the people on a grassroots level, put a candidate in office that wants to check the monopolies of corporations, that wants to check fossil fuel production that's eroding our climate and killing our ecosystems. If we want to, pass something like universal child care or a care credit, those things that we would want to invigorate our communities and give us a chance to thrive as a society are in direct competition or an opposition to the earnings of corporations. Corporations depend on an extractive economic system to get their money. So at the heart of this really is an elite few utilizing greed and managing, throwing all of their material resources at ensuring they continue to have political control and social control. And that really erodes democracy. That really harms our communities. It's creating a climate and ecosystems globally, particularly in the South, that aren't livable. And that's why it's a worthwhile pursuit to resist and organize around these folks.
And how do you do that? Because yeah, absolutely. We got to resist it. We got to organize. So how do you all do that?
So what we do is we track dark money. We start with investigate and audit. We're constantly watching where the Koch network is spending its money. And we do this through public records requests. We do this through investigative journalism. We do this through like whistleblowers and students that are constantly pressuring their universities to turn over donor agreements. And we start to trace the money. And we demonstrate how there are strings attached. Like, for example, in 2018, we got access to donor agreements at George Mason University that dictated that the Charles Koch Foundation had the right to hire and fire faculty. They were allowed to determine what the curriculum was being taught. They were allowed to have access to graduate fellows that came into that program. And of course, as you expect, their curriculum and program was about this far right-wing libertarian vision of the world. And so after we connect with folks who are on the grassroots level who are impacted by these issues, we skill them up. We teach them about how to power map, how to base build, how to use communications as a tactic for storytelling and disrupting the disinformation cycle that is also a part of the Koch network. And then we put them in coalition with folks who have been doing Koch and dark money resistance work for the last 15 plus years in various states and locations. And so that really has helped us build sort of this grassroots resistance against the Koch network further capturing these democratic institutions.
It seems like a lot of their effectiveness is based on the secrecy of how they operate.
Yes. That has always been the key. We have incredible folks like Jane Mayer, who has absolutely done us a service in producing the book Dark Money, helping us understand how these networks operate in the shadows. We've got, books like Shadow Network. We've got, of course, Nancy McLean's Democracy in Chains, talking about the long-term plan from the Koch network. Inspired by James Buchanan and Powell to really reshape our democracy. And, my grandmama always used to tell me that like the best disinfectant is some sunshine. And so that's really what it is, And as we and others who are part of this sort of like follow the money, check corporate power movement, as we've been investigating and telling these stories and exposing them, they've only gotten more sophisticated around the disinformation and basically being able to outpay some of us because they can buy news media. They can hire 1,000 journalists to tell their version of a story. And so, as I'm sure so many are accustomed to now after COVID denialism and the insurrection, the coup that is still happening after the big lie, that they are doing less of the hiding and more of doing it out in plain sight and then creating disinformation about what they're actually doing.
Yeah, one of the campaigns that is really interesting to me that you're working on is what's happening in K through 12 around critical race theory, and that because when you hear UnKoch My Campus, at first I was like, oh, like they do work at universities, which in colleges, which I know you do. But then when I started looking into more of the organization, I saw that you did all this work around K-12.
Yes.
And especially now, since there's been this very deliberate misinformation, it is totally rooted in misinformation because no school in K through 12 is teaching the complexities of critical race theory as which is this legal theory, yeah. Although we also, use it some of us also use it in social work too, because it's branched out, right? So I'm really interested in that one and like the anti 1619 project backlash that's happening. I was kind of hoping you could speak on that and how you're, organizing against it.
Yeah. So our team back in the summer of 2021 started to see tiny little talking points emerge because, again, we spend I like to say that we spend our days steeped in the toxic waste of Koch think tanks so other people don't have to. And so we're always surveilling their websites. We're always going to with Zoom now, they have so many like conferences and different press opportunities. And so we'll go on and we'll listen and we'll watch, like, what are they doing? What are they planning? And we started hearing critical race theory. And then we decided we'll audit a select group of their think tanks. And so we went through about 28 to 23 think tanks and saw on their sites that they had provided toolkits and talking points. And then we're disseminating those to target Koch-funded elected officials on the state level. And then within a couple of months, we started seeing Fox News as well as other fake news sites that are some which are Koch controlled or Koch owned, talking about critical race theory as a form of racism against white people. And we knew we had to act. And so we published our report. We demonstrated how just a small group of Koch think tanks created this wave. And then we also showed how many of the parent groups that were showing up to these key states, particularly in the South, where there's an ability to swing working class white folks toward more toward the left, started showing up at these school boards and creating this fake moral panic, like actual like AstroTurf groups who had never lived in that area, did not have kids in the school district, but were showing up. And then of course the news broke that Chris Rufo admitted that he saw this as a power issue for the radical right in the midterms and moving on. And then they means tested their theory in Virginia, which led to the Youngkin win, which was a big upset. And so this is a thing that they have been doing forever. They did it with diversity, equity, and inclusion during the Obama race. And they did it prior to that when there was traction, particularly in 2001, around climate. And they went to school board meetings and said, you can't teach our children about climate because you're giving them anxiety. And it was a whole moral panic that just didn't exist. And so what we did after our report was we began to reach out to our partners like National Public Education Association, like the Coalition for Public Schools, Save Our Schools Arizona, and provided political education, gave them our resource, and talked about how people can start pointing this moral panic, this new culture war, back to the Koch network, because communities need to understand outside billionaire corporate influencers are creating this radicalization and polarization in our communities. It's not us, right? Before this culture war was manufactured in our communities, we were just trying to figure out how to survive COVID in the schools, right? Like we were just trying to figure out how to balance these multiple threats and crisis. And ultimately, our organizing is about political education, informing folks, and getting the word out. And so, of course, I've had multiple op-eds. One that was in The Nation called "The Radical Capitalists Behind the Critical Race Furor." Charles Koch's public representative folks actually reached out to The Nation and tried to get them to take it down. The Nation said no. Here's all of her citations. It's all public information. And about a week after they refused to take it down and the article was going viral, Charles Koch Foundation and Stand Together issued a statement saying they did not support the banning of critical race theory. To date, ALEC, which is, again, their corporate commerce for-profit wing of what they do, has been proliferating model policy on the local and state level to ban critical race theory. Now, Koch Industries and their partners are major shareholders in ALEC. So again, another way that they're not hiding what they're doing, but they're using disinformation with journalism and earned media to really lie and sort of bait and switch folks their understanding of who's really behind all of this.
It is wild because you see all these viral videos of, white parents, and even some parents of color, at these school board hearings, and also then they're like terrorizing school board members too. And people are leaving their positions and they're scared. Do you all like organize people to show up at these school board hearings or meetings as well, and present a different view?
Yes, so we have done several statements helping to build a coalition power with families who are attending these school board meetings and they need sort of like a national voice speaking to this. We've done a lot of virtual trainings for folks on how to do like a recruitment strategy. We have definitely amped up the amount of like scanning that we've done of media so that if we see that there's a new site where there's panic and the school board is about to be targeted, we can call on our coalition partners that are on the ground in those various cities and states and say, hey, this is about to come to your school board. Here's how you can counteract it. And here's how you can diffuse the really like polarizing situation. So yeah, we do that work. With digital organizing, the limitations of COVID and having such a small team, it's really difficult, but we've been rolling with what we have and we feel like we've been making an impact for sure.
Yeah, it's so important to expose it. I'm in Florida and
ooh,
yeah.
You got DeSantis.
We've got DeSantis, we've got anti-CRT, and now we've got this anti-LGBTQ plus bill where like I don't even totally understand how this would even function, where like you can't even talk about LGBTQ folks in schools. Like I am beside myself with it.
You also have a Koch-funded candidate who ran for president of a university, lost, and now is trying to get DeSantis to fast track him as a candidate. And both of those folks have ties to the Koch network, and I'm happy to send you some information on that. But it's really like a hostile takeover on all fronts. And what is produced from the things that the Koch network invest in is this authoritarianism. And this authoritarianism and fascism is a direct response to the fact that, particularly in the last couple of years, folks have been able to see glimpses of having a multiracial feminist democracy. And they know that in a multiracial feminist democracy, it's not business as usual. Cisgender, wealthy, elite, white Christian men are not going to be on, quote, like the biggest recipients of that kind of world. And so really, they in their attempts to maintain the old world, the old way of doing things that is not serving all of us, but only serving a few of us, they're creating the conditions for this fascism. And it's, I think in the United States, we have this belief of exceptionalism of like, this isn't the United States. How could this happen? But globally, when you think about it, anytime like a majority race or like ethno-religious group begins to lose power, particularly when a democracy was attempted, it does devolve into this like authoritarian fascism. What no one expected was the massive amount of money that the Koch network, as well as other right-wing billionaires, have been pouring into investing, not relinquishing their power, would fast-track the United States in this way.
So would an overturning of Citizens United in and of itself, put a huge block to what they're able to do?
I think there's a lot of folks, a lot of theorists and scholars who say that it's too late to overturn Citizens United, that the damage has been done. But I really feel that it would be a non-reformist reform, meaning that it would be an opportunity for us to really build power and check some corporations in some big ways. I also think that For the People Act, if we could get it through, would be another act of harm reduction while folks are doing systemic structural organizing and transformation work. But yeah, I would love to see Citizens United overturned in my lifetime.
Something that I'm thinking about, we're recording this at the end of January. This is going to go live in February. And, Biden is going to be able to nominate a Supreme Court justice. And he's promised to nominate a Black woman. And just today, because this is like brand new, I'm already seeing tons of right-wing stuff about, the whole qualifications issue. And, they're the ones making it about race because they've always had historically, right, like white men who that was their main qualification on as judges, right? Or they got, Barrett through, in like 39 days after Ginsburg died.
We should look at her qualifications.
Right. So I was like, to me, it seems, talking to you and thinking of these think tanks and Koch money and this network, like these talking points have been ready to go, right?
Yes, yes. Yeah, absolutely. You should check out the work of Lisa Graves, a great comrade and advisor to UnKoch My Campus. And she has led around Koch work and ALEC work for a really long time. And she's just like a vanguard. But she, as well as UnKoch and other folks, have been calling out how that Koch network has been court packing on every level Koch pro-Koch judges, to the point where they'll hold seminars for judges or folks who are on the track to become judges. And there was a report that showed that after attending these seminars, they were harder on Black and brown folks around criminalization. They were more lenient on fossil fuels, right? And so Amy Coney Barrett, Gorsuch, and what's the other one that I've pushed out of my mind because he was so
Kavanaugh.
Yeah, sorry. We had actions against him for one of our students' campaigns, and so I've just erased him. So all three of them are DeVos family Koch network picks for the Supreme Court. And it's no accident that that the Koch network's rhetoric and the underbelly of its rhetoric is anti-Semitic and anti-Black. And that's because understanding that those rising majorities, like people of color, folks who have experienced genocide and dispossession, folks who have been enslaved for economic progress, those stories and the rise of those folks go against the ultimate myth of the libertarian movement, which is meritocracy and individual responsibility, right? And to your point, I was listening to CNN this morning while I was getting ready with my kiddos, and a person who considers themselves liberal was commenting, and they were like, "Look at this woman. She's a Black woman. She's the daughter of slaves." And I just thought, how interesting that the neoliberal cultural habits that are so deeply embedded in white supremacy is how you name and speak about a Black woman, and without naming her achievements, but you don't speak about Kavanaugh or Gorsuch or Barrett that way. What would it look like if commentators had been Neil Gorsuch, a candidate for the Supreme Court whose family built their wealth off of enslaving Africans, but we don't say that about white folks. Black people always have to be she's from the indigenous people who were on the Trail of Tears, or she was part of the Haitian enslaved people. And that's not the full story of who we are. But yeah, you're right. These people are going to dog whistle white supremacy and anti-Blackness and misogynoir, because these women are not going to represent to them, through their lens of white supremacy and white nationalism, qualified candidates no matter what their credentialing is.
Yeah, they're really masters at flipping the narrative and controlling the narrative, in the sense that the word indoctrination, right? That's one of their terms that they're using about critical race theory, right? Is this is indoctrinating our students to hate white people and to hate this country, where it's what have they been doing to indoctrinate? They're all about indoctrination. It's just they're indoctrinating what they want people to believe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to Charles Koch's credit, one of the things he's always said, because he sort of has this overlap in philosophy and the sociology schools of thought, is that we're in a battle for ideas, and but the reality is, for so many of us who go, "Oh no, this is just a policy fight. This isn't a culture idea battle." Is that the culture wars on the right, we keep losing because we don't have sites of belonging, because we're not willing to wage in, and we have this particularly folks who identify as leftists of we have this kind of purity test where we don't engage in those kind of things. We're going to win in a fair way. But the reality is we're all making culture. We're all creating behaviors and sites of belonging constantly. We just have to determine who gets to have a thriving generative existence in the kind of realities we're creating for ourselves? And so if indoctrination looks like children should have access to healthcare no matter their gender identity. Children should have science-based sexual education and education on the climate reality. And we should teach factual history so that we don't repeat it and we can learn from our past. If that's the indoctrination that they're afraid of, it begs the question, what kind of world do they want? Well, we know what kind of world they want because anti-Semitism and Holocaust denialism is on the rise, right? People are quoting MLK to MLK's daughter on Twitter and saying that MLK would be ashamed of her, right? It's these folks who have been in their homogenous bubbles and believe that hegemony is the thing that will save them and preserve their well-being. But the reality is the global majority has already begun to shift, and we will continue to be the rising majority. And in a place and time where trans, Black, Southern girls with disabilities have what they need to thrive and have a meaningful life, that's actually the same world where white folks who don't share any of those characteristics can survive and thrive. It's not a limited world. It's an expansive, abundant world. But because white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy limits the imagination so much, those folks can't conceive of themselves existing in that world. And so they're reacting from this place of spiritual, social, relational fear and retaliation, rather than figuring out how they might join with us to belong in this world where we have enough heat and cooling for everyone's homes, and everyone has a home to live in, and people have education, and we're not killing our food systems and our animal relatives, right? Like, that's a beautiful version of the world. But what their corporate overlords are telling them, it is, like what the rhetoric that you hear, that they're all going to be put in internment camps with tags on their arms, and that is how people have utilized anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism to stoke this white anxiety and fear for centuries now.
Yeah, the stuff that's going on right now around like vaccines and masks and the right and folks like putting on, like saying stuff like we're all Jews and wearing Stars of David. Like for me as a Jewish person, it's like, it makes me physically sick when I see that stuff. Yeah. Cause it's like, wow, like now you want to be Jew. Like the whole thing is just like so insane to me. It's like hard to even comprehend that people are doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
But there's clearly, there's someone came up with that idea. Like it didn't, right? Like something's behind all that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Charles Koch in his PR tours around his book would quote Frederick Douglass and said that the reason why Frederick Douglass was like so fantastic was because he was an entrepreneur who taught himself to read and write after he was released from enslavement so he could get a job and earn like $1 a month. It's the myth of exceptionalism that hides enslavement and chattel slavery, right? It's like
so for him, his interest in Frederick Douglass is to use him as an example around meritocracy or something like that.
Yeah, meritocracy, and Frederick pulled himself up by his bootstraps, and so all other people can too because look at this.
Wow.
But the reality is that like Frederick created a pathway for sure, but the gag here is that like Charles wants us to work. He wants us to like start new businesses and do all kinds of different things because ultimately it's working for the ultra wealthy elite, right? Like when we're investing in their version of the economy, they're benefiting off of our labor. So of course he's going to promote Latinx entrepreneurship or Black people from urban areas who, need to start up new businesses because it all goes back to the same like commerce affiliations that he gets a dividend from. But if we reimagine an economy, one that was rooted in care, one that was rooted in liberation and not oppression, well, that's something that he's definitely been organizing against. And I think that's telling.
Absolutely. Yeah. Could you actually just kind of summarize some of like the key issues that the Koch network, again, I know you talked about in the beginning, but just kind of go over like, just so people can really, hear that part of like these, like, cause someone's going to find either one or multiple of those issues that they care about. So can you kind of hit on what is like kind of like their key agenda, I guess, that through certain issues that they're working on right now?
Yeah. Well, they work under an umbrella of privatization. So that's the first place that you start: corporate power and privatization. And then from there, they have done things like bolster the radical Christian right movements. Think about folks that have opposed LGBTQIA marriage, trans bathroom bans, affirming healthcare for trans youth participating in sports. They're behind that. Housing, whenever the housing moratorium was happening so that no one could be evicted, the Koch network had their lobbyists pressure the lifting of that. And once it was lifted and people, particularly in the South, like through Texas, began to be evicted, they bought that property. They bought up all of that land. They're also buying public lands so that they can privatize and ensure that they can continue to operate. Our courts and our judicial system, they've been reshaping them, for the last 10 years plus, stacking them with folks that are pro-corporate power and anti-people power. In K through 12 education, in partnership with other billionaire donors, they have been resegregating schools by gutting public school funding and then proposing private charter schools. These private charter schools, or even the school choice movement, disproportionately keep out Black and Latinx folks. And on top of that, the curriculum that they provide is super regressive, right? It whitewashes history. It talks about enslavement and chattel slavery as a source of building the greatest economic system in the world. It erases indigenous genocide and dispossession. Goodness gracious, voting and electoral organizing, they've always been behind backing some of the most egregious candidates. I mean, DeVos, who just completely obliterated our education system during Trump's administration, is a part of the Koch network. So really, wherever you turn, they, like many wealthy people, have invested their money in multiple things. Their investments happen to be just really nefarious and pernicious ventures.
Thank you for, going over all that. They're involved with a lot, almost any, right-wing type issue that we could think of. They're probably somehow connected to it, is what it sounds like.
Yeah, well, and I want to be clear. Yes, it's a radical right oligarchy, but they also have like moderate Dems, like corporate Dems, like Cinnamon Mansion, have direct relationship to the Koch network. And guess what? They've held up some of the things that Biden promised the people. And when we voted for him in that fair election that we had, he had the responsibility to deliver these promises, and thinking that we have a majority of Dems, but it turns out the Koch affiliated folks are keeping us from getting the things done that we really needed to get done for our communities, especially after surviving this continued pandemic.
So Cinema and Mansion are connected to Koch funding?
Yeah.
And Cinema is actually a social worker and still teaches policy.
And has been censured by the AZ Democrats, I saw.
Yeah, which we're waiting on the National Association of Social Workers to actually do something. There's been a campaign and a petition started by Boston-based Liberation Health Collective to put pressure on NASW. So for social work folks listening, we'll put a link to that in the notes, as well as some of the articles that you've talked about. I'll get those links from you and I'll put them in the show notes so people will have them. So I want to, you mentioned one thing about you're a mom and as you were living, working, raising your kids, you didn't know what think tanks were and things like that, which I don't think most of us do, right? So how did you get into this work?
It was really serendipitous. I had been fired from NARAL Pro-Choice America as a digital organizing fellow. I just didn't fit their white feminist lens of the world, and I kept trying to integrate racial justice into my digital organizing campaigns, and it just didn't go well. And I was just burnt out with like the Grass Tops nonprofit, like national sector of movement work. So I was like, I love comms, I love digital organizing. I'll just do some consulting for a while. And I saw this RFP, this request for a proposal from a little student-led project called UnKoch My Campus. And I was like, I don't know who Charles Koch is, and I don't know what any of this stuff is about, but I'll just apply. And, you know, the vision of UnKoch at the time was around transparency and academic freedom. The co-founders, who were white folks, believed that if you could just tell the public that there were strings attached to donor agreements, and you could get universities to no longer accept donor agreements that had strings attached, that it would equal justice. And so, you know, I dove into the history of Charles Koch, and within 2 weeks of like reading all of the reports and the cited sources and doing a deep dive in the history, I was like, well, damn. I thought I was coming to do an easy job and just rest, but I happened upon the Death Star of the right. Like, this is some real conspiracy that's happening. And I knew, you know, I'm a Virgo and I'm a very protective mom. And when I realized that a vast majority of the threats that my family had directly faced were produced by Koch or the entities that are associated with the Koch network, I was like, oh, well, this is like an avenging kind of moment. So I did digital organizing for UnKoch for about 9 months, and then the co-founders started having quite a bit of infighting. And as like young nonprofit projects do, some folks went their own ways, and the remaining co-founders voted that I step in as executive director. And so I've spent the last 3, now going on my 4 years, revamping the strategy, reevaluating the tactics, and really pivoting the UnKoch work to be both an investigative journalism / base building / organizing operation. Because we really want the work we do not just to be an announcement of the problem, but an opportunity for folks to really take action and build shared power and solidarity around the problem. We see ourselves as a disruption entity that puts up a good fight to block the right from further controlling and capturing higher education, because it is a site of power. It is a democratic institution that can be reimagined and transformed for social good. Even though it's becoming increasingly corporate and private. We're not ready to give up on higher education and education in general. And you know, it says something that of all the places the Koch network invests their money, they most heavily invest their money in education. And I think that's, you know, stems from their history of being the folks who resisted Brown versus Board of Education and school integration. And they understand that education, particularly public education, is a direct pathway to social and economic transformation.
Thanks for sharing how you got into it. And yeah, absolutely. Like, they know that the power of education, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be putting so much money and energy into it. You know, where does where do you kind of pull strength from and kind of pull like your own thinking from?
Well, I'm in deep relationship with a beautiful practice community of, you know, it's intergenerational, and 10 days of every month we meet together virtually and engage in solidarity practice for care. BOLD, which is Black Organizing Leadership for Leadership and Dignity, Denise Perry, Alta Star, their wisdom and their teachings have bolstered me and taught me about new ways of being in the world. You know, I look to visionary folks in the South like Suzanne Farr, who her work has taught me so much around the radical right, particularly the Christian right. And then at the end of the day, you know, it's my Black, queer, trans family. My daughter is about to be 15. She's a Black trans girl, and just to live with her and see how she engages in self-determination and how she sees the world is always refreshing to me. And, you know, outside of that, I cycle a lot. I used to play roller derby because hitting people, body checking people is like a very therapeutic practice I didn't know that I needed. And when all of that fails, I'm either like baking bread in the kitchen with my wife or like drinking a lot of gin.
All right. I remember like when I was younger, like they'd actually have like roller derby on ESPN and stuff.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
late
They
night.
bank track. Yeah, I was flat track, and my roller derby name was Boombox.
Oh,
So
I love
yeah,
that. I love Boombox. That is a great name. Thanks for sharing, that and just about like your thinking and bold, and that's amazing that you have that too, that you are part of that. Just sounds phenomenal.
yeah. We the beauty is, and I think this is often lost in folks that are part of social change movements or structures that have been captured by like the nonprofit industrial complex, is we have generations and generations of living elders who were doing this work before you got like a 501c3 status to do this work, right? Like they were doing all kinds of dope community work. And actually one thing that I haven't shared with you is my original background is in communications and psychology. And I had a private practice as a licensed therapist. And it just got so difficult for me because I'm a doer and a systems thinker to constantly have my clients come in, and we would get them I would watch them do this massive amount of work and transformation, get them to a place where they could go out feeling some rehabilitation and recovery from their suffering, much of which was actually like a product of systemic oppression and not from any personal failing. And then they'd come back in 6 months re-injured by the same systems. And so I was like, okay, cool. I'll be a therapist on the weekend, and then I'll be a systems change organizer activist, Monday through Friday. And that's what I've been doing, right? Like, would we have the rate of maternal mental health, perinatal mood, and anxiety disorders if we had paid leave and birthing folks could stay with their babies and didn't have to dump them off at a daycare? And there's no disrespect to those who choose to do that, but there's just so many variables to like our well-being and our determinants of health that we're not naming are directly a result of capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. And until we really come into conflict with those structures and start building new ways of being in community, we're going to have like soaring mental health pathology and struggles. And I say that as someone who has post-traumatic stress disorder and multiple suicide survivor and have my own share of psychopathology. So,
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing all that. And that's something a lot of guests of mine have touched on, over a number of different episodes of like, we can't CBT our way out of, systemic oppression. It doesn't work that way. That's real. And we pathologize people when the pathology is really the systemic pathology,
Yeah, which is the trap of the narrative, the neoliberal society that we're living in, right? It focuses on like, it's the individual and it's the individual. But the reality is like, our communities are unwell. Like there's a collective unwellness. And there's some nuance around like madness and disability that I just want to hold in tension, that we're not erasing that some of us just like, that's who we are as people. And it's not necessarily a result of injury, or even if it is a result of like psychic or physiological injury, it's still valid. You don't have to be like sane to count. But Lord have mercy. I would love to see a world where we start with care and healing, and we have a beloved state that really works for us and not war and corporate consumption.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it's the right term, but like, cause I know there's like a lot of debate about this, but, to me, white supremacy seems pathological, to me. And I know other people don't like to say, don't like it sometimes when people say like racism is a disease and things like that. And I get that. But it's an irrational belief to believe that a group of people, because of the color of their skin, are superior to another group. I mean, that's just an irrational belief to have. So to me, there's a pathology there, which then inflicts this harm on everybody.
Yeah, I was reading a case study a couple of weeks ago that talked about sociopathy and borderline issues as it relates to the population of like white young people in the millennial generation who were raised underneath evangelical movements. And I think that piece was sort of hitting on what you're talking about, right? Like, we know it's a lie. Those of us who've seen behind the curtain of white supremacy absolutely know it's a lie. And when we don't live into that world, we experience a form of liberation and freedom that ultimately helps us reorient our sense of like our psychosocial development of identity. But I understand folks' critique of it, but I also absolutely see where you're coming from, that it is a collective working delusion. Where many people are constructing these archetypes of their identity that's based in violence, subjugation, and domination. And anytime you're in those spaces, it is inherently like soul draining. It's death making. And we as organic, relatives to this earth are not suited for like death making work. It's just not how we thrive in community. Adversely, I think the folks that push back against the disease and pathologizing of it feel uncomfortable. Not that I can speak for them, en masse, but I think some of the points that emerge from their critiques of that approach, that analysis, is that it's also structural and institutional, right?
100%.
And so making a disease sort of makes it hard to make the case for abolishing the systemic, institutional, and structural components of it. But on an interpersonal level, yes. I mean, I think that I've had folks that came into my office and were seeking help for all kinds of things, and I use narrative therapy approach as my theoretical orientation, and we talk about identity. And for white folks who were steeped and like fully bought into white identity, their development of who they are as people is it's not there, right? Mm-hmm. It's not there. And we go through sort of like this deconstructing process as a part of their work in therapy session. And then building themselves up outside of this dominant narrative of like, you're exceptional and you're the most respectable and you're good and you should strive for perfectionism and avoid conflict, and it has to be either or. And then their anxiety dissipates, and then they can sleep better, and they have less intrusive thoughts and self-harm, because the rigidity and the binary nature and the limiting imagination of white supremacy, it shaves off whole people and kind of puts them in the box. And that includes folks who come from Euro backgrounds, who have white skin, right? It includes those people. So I also come from the camp that doesn't, folks have a lot of critiques for, but I come from the camp of people that say that white supremacy actually also harms white people intensely and directly, because it dehumanizes them and it assigns them de facto to a legacy of violence and domination.
Totally. And to be considered white, there's like so much that has to be that groups have given up, mm-hmm. Like as a Jewish person, right? Like at one point we weren't, those of us who get to be considered mm-hmm. white, because not, right, there's lots of Jews of color, especially mm-hmm. worldwide, but like, what did we give up? Like my grandparents still spoke some Yiddish, but like they didn't pass it on. And that's like assimilation. That was like to assimilate, Just that's a small example, but it is a big one too, actually, with language is powerful. So
absolutely. But you see right now in this political moment how white supremacy and agents of white supremacy who were like, come over here, Jews or white Latinx folks, mm-hmm. you're white, will immediately, right? Like they didn't care if it was the white Latinx folks that they were putting in cages at the border. They don't care if it's Jewish folks who are now like anti-Semitic flyers being passed and the Holocaust denial is being codified in school board meetings. So really white supremacy will possess and then dispossess depending on power. And so it's really on all of us, those who, I can't move in and out of whiteness. I've been Black my whole life, but folks like you, who could be maybe assigned as white and build power is like, well, actually, if I'm going to be a white person, I'm going to use it to disrupt this system. I'm going to use it to shift power, and then I'm going to demonstrate a new identity of, well, my whiteness can look like abolishing white supremacy. My whiteness can look like co-conspirating toward justice. So you have the opportunity to create new identities, but like, don't take the bait. Like, there's no, your enemy doesn't give you gifts, and white supremacy is an enemy to all of us. Like, if you get something from white supremacy, that's because later they're going to call on you to take the pound of flesh. And sometimes it's more than a pound of flesh. It's your life or your family or the people you come from being decimated. And so it's not worth the trade-off.
Yeah, I really like how you said that. There was this journal called Race Trader by Noel Ignatieff, and who passed away, I think, last year or the year before. And their, kind of like main line was treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity. And I always liked that a lot, that line.
Yeah. Check out Dr. Barner-Hesse. He's got like the 8 white identities, moving from like ally to like white abolitionist.
Mm-hmm.
And he puts it on a spectrum of white ally who like acknowledges white supremacy, but still fully benefits and does the performance of justice, but it doesn't cost them anything. Moving all the way down to the white abolitionist is like, no, whiteness is a violent construct in this current iteration of society, and we're going to abolish it.
100%. So Jasmine, if folks, want to get involved with the work you're doing, how can they support your work and get involved?
Well, goodness, we are actually launching a brand new project that would be perfect for any of the folks who feel that they're in alignment. So, of course, UnKoch My Campus is always going to be a student-led project. It's always going to be in universities. But we knew in this moment, with like the threat to realizing democracy and the growing fascism, we needed to build out a coalition. And so we launched a project called the Common Good Generation. And the Common Good Generation is a multi-ethnic, multi-generational coalition that is going to really be demonstrating how we transform and reimagine democratic institutions. And so it's less of a disruption intervention campaign, which is what UnKoch is, and it's more of a cultural organizing, base building campaign. And so we're going to start bringing people in, encouraging people wherever they're at to start to launch a Common Good Generation chapter and come organize and build with us. Because when we think about what we're going to be facing in the next 2 to 6 years, it's intense, and we need to be sitting in intergeneration wisdom circles and learning from our elders. We need to be thinking about, how do we not just complain about the things that we don't like? How do we build things that are generative and that are the futures that we want? And so this will be a site of experimentation. So yeah, check us out, thecommongoodgeneration.org, or you can drop me a line at jasmine@unkochmycampus.org, and we are looking for volunteers and paid organizers and folks who want to conspire with us to really reimagine how we can be in community.
That's awesome. Yeah, I hope some folks who are checking out the podcast will take you up on that and get involved. And I just want to thank you again for coming on here, and really thank you for doing the work.
Yep. Agitate, organize. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Doing the Work, Frontline Stories of Social Change. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please follow on Twitter and leave positive reviews on iTunes. If you're interested in being a guest or know someone who's doing great work, please get in touch. And thank you for doing real work to make this world a better place.